Well, hello. Welcome to another episode of What the Flock. So excited to be back in the studio.
Yeah, it's good.
Hoyt.
This is officially the beginning of season 2.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Back in the studio, at least.
Yeah, well,
We've
exactly.
filmed a couple in
That's
between
right.
here and there.
Studio season 2,
Yes.
specify.
Yes. In our world, this is our first day back in the studio, which is fun.
Yeah.
So we were supposed to have our friend Christy with us here today. And I got to tell you, Hoyt, I love the way the universe always has a better plan. So I went to pick up Christy this morning, and something had happened in her life physically, which led to all these other conversations that we were having. So Christy's not here, but in honor of Christy, she said I could still share some of her story. So we'll do that.
Oh, great.
Kind of interlaced with what we're going to talk about, because it spurred, I think, an even bigger conversation for us to have. So we're just going to go with it.
Let's go with it.
This is a from the hip, really no notes. So let's dig on in and have some fun. So as usual, I'm going to start with the quote of the day. Okay, so here we go. To live in the body of a survivor is to never be able to leave the scene of the crime. I cannot ignore the fact that I live here. That's by Blythe Baird. And we'll explain that quote a little bit. I can see your wheels are already turning.
Yeah.
So this is a very true quote, but I'm going to add a little caveat there to what I think about this quote as far as in trauma recovery, cult survivor recovery. Because there are spectrums and degrees of each crime, so to speak, right?
Sure.
In trauma, everyone has a crime scene, but it might be less severe than someone else's, as within different crimes, let's say. There's a spectrum. There's
shades of gray.
There's
right?
shades of gray, right.
A recurring theme that we talk about. But yeah, I think what I like about the quote is when trauma's occurred, you're never going to forget it. I think the greatest metaphor I've ever heard is you got in a car accident. You're never going to forget you had a car accident. You may have healed. You might have some scars. You may not have scars. But the actual event is not going to just bury in your consciousness somewhere, and it's never going to go away.
Correct.
How you choose to deal with that event and how it serves you or harms you is really kind of up to you, depending on how you make those choices.
Right.
So I think taking on the mantle of being a survivor is also taking on the mantle of saying, I'm going to own this event. I'm going to continue to not only talk about it, but process it. And as I continue to take on new information, learn from it. And it's the way I look at the trauma that I experienced, certainly with the cult, it's a gift that keeps giving. I keep learning from it as I continue to learn and take in new information. I self-reflect. I reflect back on things I did and said, or things I wish I had said or wish I had done, and it continues to evolve. So I think trauma, when dealt with, becomes an incredible, empowering resource. It's just challenging to get up the courage to do it.
Right. And along those same lines, and I don't know how with eternal values, if you would say that people had wildly different experiences in your group, or mildly, because I think there's a chasm of a difference of each person's experience.
Absolutely. I think everyone had their own experience, and even when, and for the audience, my group was Eternal Values. That's what we're referencing. Everyone had their own experience, and I think it's important to acknowledge that just because I suffered a certain way and I've chosen to deal with those wounds the way I have, doesn't mean that's now a one size fits all formula to recover. And because I wouldn't even say recovery is something you ever get over. I love what someone once said about trauma. It's not something you ever get over. It's what you get through. And I think that's really the way to look at it. Is that it's an ongoing process. We're all a work in progress, and these type of things, ultimately, if dealt with, I feel really serve us, and that's the thing that is counterintuitive. And by having these type of conversations and talking to fellow survivors, we're hoping to really kind of put out that platform to say, hey, First of all, there's nothing to be embarrassed about having a cultic experience. And one of our other themes we talk about, probably mostly everyone out there has had some form of a cultic experience, maybe not realizing it, maybe not realizing that that was actually the most accurate description for what they experienced. But that type of experience leads to trauma. And whether you choose to deal with it or not can greatly affect your, the health of your psyche.
Right. Well, it's interesting. And this really brought a lot of this to the surface yesterday when I was talking to Christy, because when Christy was going to come on, I didn't feel like I was pushing her, but I was on the fence on, is she ready, to talk about this? And she's such a lovely, giving person that she's like, I can do it. I can push through. Like, she wants to give, she wants to help, she wants to serve. And so I was a little on the fence. Again, the powers that be of the universe stepped in today and said, no, she's not ready. Right? So, but in our conversations when we were talking, she wanted us to blur her face and, have a hat and have no one know who she was, because there's one, and she's a former Jehovah's Witness.
Right.
So she's a JW, we call it.
XJW. Yeah.
XJW. And so that's the group that she was raised in. Yeah. So her experience, I thought, was unique because she was raised in it. But as soon as she turned 18, she decided to leave, right? Because she wanted to live a normal life.
And that's a really fascinating thing about a lot of people who are born into cultic groups. A lot of times when they get to those kind of teenage rebellious years is when a lot of them get out. It's an interesting dynamic. It's very different than like you and I, our experience going into the things a little bit older. I met my cult leader when I was 16, but I didn't really kind of put the roots down as my commitment to the cause or the group until my early 20s.
Right.
So that's different than growing up in it. I mean, it's its own kind of category. And I hope we get to talk to it at some point.
Well, thus the spectrum, the different experiences that each person has had. And here's the example that I'll give you in my conversation with Christy. Was that in the Jehovah Witnesses, you're excommunicated if you leave, right? Much like Scientology, you have no more contact with family. They shun you. They ignore you. So that was her decision, was, am I allowed to go live a free life and experience life as an individual human? Or do I stay to have a relationship with my parents, my family, And she decided to leave. And, surprise, surprise, everyone except one completely stopped talking to her. Yeah. So it's been, I don't know how many, 20, 30, 40 years since she's talked to some of them. Oh, so her struggle in coming on our podcast was she's got one relationship of a distant relative that will talk to her. One. So she thought, if they ever found out I did this, I'd lose my only person that talks to me. So my comment to her, and this is how Christy and I are entirely different. Again, the spectrum, the way we've handled it is so much different. The way we entered our cults is so much different. So it's all fair. Yeah. And there's, like you said, there's no one size fits all. But she's like, I don't want to lose that relationship. And it's someone she never or rarely talks to anyways. It's not like an ongoing friendship. So I was like, Christy, you are just a better person than I am, because I would have been like, if you don't let me tell my story, you can F off, right? I don't want you, bye-bye. That's how I move through life. But with Christy, that's not a trigger for her. So it's fair, and I honor that, and I respect that she doesn't want to potentially lose that one relationship, because she's not really feeling the urge to have to talk about what happened like I did.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge part of it is I think as you move down that recovery path, there's a need to talk and need to find what you consider a safe person or a safe environment to do that. Speaking publicly is pretty intimidating. I mean, you went through quite your own experience when we first started doing this podcast. So it's a different animal, and it's something that is not to be taken lightly. But I think it's this type of when we talk about the journey of the survivor, going from victim to survivor to thriver. I think that survivor to thriver piece of it is getting more comfortable in your own skin and starting to feeling almost a duty to share. I think part of the way I look at my there's a certain point where you go, my goodness, I got myself in a situation I would have never imagined.
Right.
But I also got myself out of it
Right.
by some fashion. And by doing that, I learned that maybe I'm a lot stronger and more resilient than I would ever give myself credit for if I hadn't had this experience. And I think that type of confidence that starts to build ultimately goes into a place of saying, well, if I did overcome these obstacles and I did learn all these lessons and I've discovered kind of all these silver linings, am I just supposed to keep it to myself? Or should I maybe share it? Because I certainly know I've heard plenty of stories over the years where whether it's on the radio or a TV or whatever, you come across someone's personal story of where they've had almost, some sort of heroic survival story.
Right.
And it's always told me that, oh my God, I thought I've had a tough situation. Now I look at this person and what they overcame and what they can talk about. And I'm like, oh, I'm so glad I went through what I went through compared to what they went through. So I think these type of stories support kind of humanity and encourage us in different ways to say, hey, we're all kind of put against the wall sometimes. And it's really a kind of a day of reckoning to discover, whether we, how we handle it. And those type of stories, I think, provide a lot of inspiration, a lot of hope, and a lot of encouragement for whatever situation we all may be in, to know, like, okay, I can probably handle what the hand I've been dealt.
Right.
And I think that's what's great about telling these stories, is that people can finally say, oh, this person I can relate to on some level. Look what they did. So if I've got something similar in my life, what's the big deal? Why can't I talk about it? Why?
Right.
And start losing some of that shame, because that's the thing that really hinders all of us, is because on some level, Christy's still carrying some shame around that event, because otherwise she would feel more comfort in kind of speaking openly about it. And that's okay. That's a natural part of the process. I would never want someone to come forward if they really weren't comfortable in doing it. So that's not what this is about, and will never be about that. But ultimately, it's trying to find and be honest to yourself where you are at that time. And sometimes you find out by trying and realizing, I'm not ready.
Sticking your toes in the water.
That's okay.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, I look back on my early days of when I was first wanting to talk about it. I was coming from a very kind of place of victimization. I wanted to just tell everyone how bad this group and these people I'd been involved with, and that they were just terrible, and kind of leaving out my responsibility and my ownership of my half in that. Because even whether you're, influenced, brainwashed, or just like the example I used earlier on, if I'm a drunk driver and I kill someone, I can't say, well, I was drunk and get a get out of jail free card. You still killed someone. You're still responsible for the events that occurred when you were in your body when these things happened. So yes, I can make the argument and say, well, I wasn't operating with my full faculties, and that probably is true, but that doesn't take away that I did what I did, I said what I said, or I didn't say something that I look back on I wish I had said, or I didn't interfere and stop something that I sat by and said nothing. So all those type of things allows you to take some accountability, and with that accountability becomes the confidence to say, hey, this is where my mind was. This is where the road I went down. This is the rabbit hole I found myself, but I got out of it.
Right.
And the more kind of subjective and kind of condemning yourself and telling that, just how real it was and how crazy way of thinking might have been at that time, the more forgiving people are. But when you hedge because you feel like, oh, I don't want people to really think I was that bad, then people, they get suspicious. They can tell you're kind of not being transparent.
Right.
And I think that's the tricky thing about speaking in public. People will pick up on that stuff, and the haters are out there, and they will come in all force if they think that you're kind of hedging your bets to try to look better. You're better off just being honest, being transparent.
Here's what happened.
And letting the warts show, and then hopefully share what that experience taught you and what you've learned from it. And then people, I find, are infinitely forgiving. But that's a hard thing to do, and sometimes you only find out by trying.
Right. Well, and it's also when you go at it the way you're talking about, just with that authentic ownership of it, and not in a criticizing yourself or the shame or the feeling bad, but the ownership with the look at what I made it through.
Yeah.
Here were my choices at the time. I made the best choices I could at the time with where I was at in life, but look at where I'm at now. That's so inspiring to people.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing. And I think that's what you're referencing as well, that there's an authenticity there that inspires people that, wow, I can tell my story too, right?
But it takes time.
It does. And it's a different path for everybody.
And I looked like early on, I got very kind of excited by the shock value that I could comfortably
we both did. We talked about that.
I could say to someone, I was in a cult for 20 years, and let that bomb explode.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, whoa. And
let me hear about that. Tell me about that.
But it was not very serving to my journey and even to the other person, because it was so jarring, and it was literally dropped like a bomb, and caused a kind of visceral reaction, which put the conversation in a hole that was hard to dig out of, because the way I was so kind of abrupt about it, and the way that I kind of was fascinated that I could shock someone, that they would think that, who is this person that's admitting this?
Right.
But that word, I've come to learn, is so triggering. Like, to just drop it without
the word cult.
The word cult, is without any context. Starts to, you basically, for the average person, they have, like, they think of maybe Jonestown or now the Nexium thing, all these things that are very, very high profile cult stories, and they immediately go to this worst case scenario. And a lot of times our experiences aren't necessarily exactly like that. So you're having to dig out of that. Well, that's not exactly what my experience was, but because you've introduced it with this very abrupt way,
sure,
you're not really serving the discussion, which is the type of thing I really like having now. So it was an evolution for me to really realize that I was better off saying something about that I had a cultic relationship with a group for 20 years. And people are like, well, what does that mean? But that fosters a more investigative conversation rather than me just going for shock value. And now everyone's just kind of, is this person weird, or is he telling me the truth, or what's happening here?
Right.
And so it's just one of these things that it's a journey in and of itself. But, I think, like your friend Christy, she's just figuring out for herself, and she'll know when she's ready to do it or not. And it's all there's no right or wrong in any of this.
There is no right or wrong.
We're all just trying to kind of make sense and heal, and so it's not about checking a box and saying, okay, now I'm ready.
Right. And I think it's a day by day thing.
Yeah.
Like today wasn't a good day for her.
Yeah.
This is not the day we're going to do this, right?
That's fine.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Well, and I wanted to add in and share with you a little bit what's been happening with my group along this.
I want to hear that.
This
Absolutely.
same topic, because we have a couple of pretty big followings on Facebook of ex-ICOC members.
Okay.
But we've kept one of the pages open so that current members can share or pipe in or chime in or say, that's not true, whatever. But I find it so fascinating that there's a couple of them, they're obviously trolling the page.
Right.
And feel the need to come in and tell us how we're all wrong, right? Or that didn't really happen, or we've changed, or, we're not that bad. And I find it fascinating because we're not going to their church service and standing on the stage telling them all what we think of them.
Right.
That's what they're living, that life. That's their choice. But because we finally have a voice, and we weren't allowed to have a voice in the group because you'd be called divisive or disfellowshipped or brought in front of the church or what have you, or rebuked or discipled. It was never a fun process to have your own opinion in the ICOC, right? So compliance was definitely the path of least resistance.
Yeah.
So now they've got really about 1 million people that have left their group.
Oh, wow.
That have a voice.
Is that more than the people that are in the group?
Oh, yeah. Because it was, it's been over 30 years of recycling. So people that left they just disappeared and were in the shadows, and we never knew what happened to them. Well, now they're kind of all coming back.
Oh, nice.
And saying, yeah, me too, me too, me too, me too. This is what happened. Or should I say, I got out, I got out, I got out, I got out,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
like our favorite hashtag with some of our favorite women that are heading up that cause.
Yeah.
But so there's a couple of them that I normally don't respond, but every now and then I will respond and say, well, what about this? Or what about these 62 emails I sent to leaders asking them to sit down with me to explain why what they did was okay? I will listen.
Yeah.
I'm willing to be persuaded. Silence, crickets, nothing, no response. So every time I bring up something that they can't argue with, again, they go silent again.
Right.
But to come on our page and to tell us all sorts of random things, to feel that need, simply because we have a voice. And the page is very nice. It's a support page. It's a survivor page. So to come on a survivor platform and say, well, let me tell you what I think about that. It's like, can we at least recover in peace from you people? Do you know what I mean? But we still let them on.
I mean, that happens with a lot of groups. Scientology is well known for that.
Right.
You know, and,
but it goes back to the spectrum thing, because they'll go on and say, well, I didn't have that experience, or I don't think that really happened. Well, hello. With 1 million people, you're going to have a spectrum of experiences. This was a international, worldwide group in every country on the planet, every major city. So yeah, there were some batshit crazy things going on that you don't know about, who's now living in Dallas or wherever this one guy lives. It's like, how can you claim that that never happened?
Right.
So there's that spectrum. So as a leader in the group, I went through things that the last rung person on the totem pole did not go through, and vice versa. So it's fair that we all had a different experience.
Well, sure. I mean, it's no different than you can take any spiritual text and read it, and people could say, well, I don't know if that happened or not. And some people say, well, I think it did happen. It's like, well, I don't think it did.
Yeah.
And there's no way to prove it, right? I mean, and even today, even if you video something, you can still tamper it. So it's like, who knows anymore?
Right.
So I think it really does come down. I think anytime you fall into this mindset of absolutes, that there's only one way or black and white type of thinking, that's where you get into hot water.
And it doesn't serve anyone.
No.
Because like you always say, there's a gray area. There's no black and white. There's no absolute.
Yeah.
There's what you experienced at that time and your perception of it. And then there is a trauma result.
Exactly.
It doesn't really matter how you got there. It happened.
Yeah. And as we were saying, as you continue to take in more information, your perception of even that trauma result alters as you continue to learn and self-reflect and just kind of get to know not only yourself, but the world we coexist in. And yeah, there's this idea of this binary all or nothing, one way or the highway mentality is just so destructive. And you see it all over the world. And that's why I always say the world we live in is very cultish. Because
you think?
Yeah, it's just
it's everywhere.
Once you develop that perspective, you start to see how it infiltrates so many aspects. Yeah, obviously the military, politics, advertising. I mean, it's the medical community.
It's everywhere.
Because and generally the doctors that are kind of schooled normally are to say, this illness may do this, or it could or should. When you're talking about possible remedies, it could, it would. You're not speaking in definitives. It's because you're just no way to know.
Right.
And the problem is there's such a comfort level in wanting to know something definitively and say, in my investigation, I want to be able to say, this is the truth now, check the box, move on. And what I find to be a healthier approach is, okay, I may have done my research and I think this looks like this is what I might want to relay as a truth, but that doesn't mean I don't keep taking in new information to keep testing it, because it could be wrong. But from what I've seen so far, I lean into, okay, I think that's the way that works. But when you get into that narrative that says this is definitive and I no longer need to take information, that's where I think things get dangerous. And you put yourself in a place of vulnerability to be manipulated, because there'll be other like-minded people say, oh, you believe what I believe. And beliefs change.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And yet beliefs are the way we usually self-identify. So when you've got a belief system that's open to be altered, there's not this comfort level of saying, oh, this is definitively the way it is, and I can stand on this pedestal and say this is the way it is. So what I'm basically talking about is either you can stay in a place of definiteness and probably be closed-minded, or you stay open-minded and definitely have your tendencies and things you kind of lean in towards. But ultimately, you stay receptive. You keep taking in information and keep learning. I feel like that's why I say we're here at Earth School. We have our Earth costumes, going to Earth School.
Right.
And ultimately,
skin suit.
Yeah. And ultimately, no one gets out of here alive. And we're just here to learn. And so I think that's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
And it's not per se about getting to the place where you have it all figured out. And people are pitching you that, run.
Right, run. If someone says, here's the definitive way.
Here's the way it works.
I have figured it all out.
Yeah.
Come this way.
Yeah.
Yeah, run. Well, and that's a great spot to share some more that happened with Christy as far as taking in new information. And I was really proud of her, because as we were talking about what she was comfortable sharing and not sharing about the Jehovah Witness group, I was like, well, Christy, have you kind of refreshed yourself on what's going on with the group, all of the data, all of the different documents that have been uncovered or leaked, especially pertaining to the child abuse and the sexual abuse.
Right.
I'm like, it's just coming out by the droves.
Yeah.
And they had these secret lists of all these kids that they knew had been, sexually abused. And Christy's like, what? What? Because she'd blocked herself off from that in any information. So when she left at 18, that's kind of all she stopped knowing about the group.
Right.
And rightly so. That's probably wise. Like, why does she need to know? So she did her own little rabbit hole. Then she starts sending me all this information. Look what I found. Look what I found.
Yeah.
Look what I found.
Yeah.
Which shows Christy's character. She was like, what? And she was bothered by that. She was moved by it. So then she started digging. And I'm like, yeah, and it's recent stuff.
Yeah.
And stuff they're uncovering about the main guys in that group is hideous.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys, this group has been a safe haven for pedophiles and a place for them to hide. It's in the data, it's in the facts. Look at these lists of children that God knows what has happened to these kids that weren't given therapy, that it wasn't ever, their abusers were never addressed. It was all shoved under the rug. They're probably going to church with these same people. As a matter of fact, I know some of them that have gone to church with these same people. And to see your parents and your spiritual family being the ones hurting you, you've read about the damage that does to the psyche.
Sure.
Especially of a child.
Sexual abuse in any time, whatever the context.
Anytime.
Yeah.
Right. But when it's a part of your daily life and your culture from the people that are supposed to protect you, I can only imagine that is...
And when it's accepted on some level as being okay.
Sure, or you're blamed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
No, it's nasty, nasty business. I mean, I'm glad she's doing the investigation.
Well, and and even though she couldn't be here with us, she really is one of the most amazing souls I've ever met. She's just a very sweet woman. So even that she couldn't be here, we still had kind of an evolutionary conversation. So I was very proud of her. She's a great human, and she's like, oh, come on someday,
Yeah, that's fine.
And if she does, great, and if not, great. I just wanted to honor her and kind of share a little bit, about her as we're chatting today.
I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge that, ultimately these stories, each person's story is unique and identified with their own personal experience, but there's themes that keep emerging.
Yeah.
And that's what I hope is the educational side of the show. It's not just about telling stories. It's about recognizing some themes and some consistencies that continue to emerge.
Well, especially in the trauma recovery side, because we can talk about stories, but I love the the recovery process, the evolutionary dynamic of recovery that we're talking about, because that's really what it's all about.
Yeah, and that's the part that usually gets left out of it. You know, people.
The most important part.
Yeah, people hear, oh, you're out, everything's fine, and Christy's a great example.
Get back to life, chop.
You get out at 18. Oh, well, you're young, you're fine, and it's not going to affect you. Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's all up to the individual how they choose to deal with it or not. But again, trauma occurred. A car accident, and you're not going to forget that car accident. So whether you choose to deal with it or not will greatly alter the way it kind of plays out.
And wouldn't you say it basically drives a stake in the dirt of your life? It's like that trauma, whether you call it a bookmark in the book, that chapter, but things shift at that point. It drives a stake.
Well, what I've witnessed firsthand from some of the people that were in my group who have kind of chosen not to deal with their trauma is you also stay stuck in time in a way.
Yeah.
And
like children with abuse, they kind of stop maturing.
Right. Well, and if it's not dealt with, it kind of unconsciously you draw yourself back into similar situations because your unconscious wants you on some level to address this, so it kind of repeats, and it can become a really unhealthy cycle or a pattern. And people may not always put it together that there's an actual pattern happening.
Right.
You just think, oh, here's another bad relationship. Here's another bad relationship. Why do I keep pulling these bad relationships? It must be me. It must be me. Well, yes and no. I mean, it goes back to, is there a commonality in some of these unhealthy relationships? Is there something coming through that kind of you find the impetus in if you go back to that initial trauma?
Right.
But if that investigation isn't happening, that's why people go into therapy. I mean, you get into the therapist, it's like, oh, tell me about your mother, tell me about your father. But that can be very, very constructive, and because we all get wounded growing up, all in different ways, and we're all kind of the walking wounded. And I think when I think about healthy relationships, it really comes down to, all right, what are my wounds and my coping mechanisms? What are your wounds and your coping mechanisms? And how well do they match up with each other? That will determine
we kind of meet in the middle.
How compatible we are.
Right.
Because we're all kind of working through stuff.
Right.
And again, I think that's...
We all have different crime scenes.
Yeah, no, exactly.
The scene of the crime.
That's exactly right. And so that's the commonality, is that we're all potentially working on stuff, and whether it matches up with one another is for us to discover. But that, I think, is part of the enjoyment of trying to figure out who are kind of our companions and allies, and those who are probably your best to kind of let fall by the wayside.
Right. Wow. Well, I want to circle back to something you said too, and I think since we're in season 2, I want to go back to this stat a lot, because you were sharing about cultic relationships are everywhere. Politics. What were some of the other things you listed off? Politics. Military. Of course, religion.
Advertising.
Advertising. Yeah, it's everywhere. The stats on indoctrination and cultic activity always boggle my brain. The fact that 1 out of every 8 people on the planet will at some point in their lifetime be directly or indirectly affected by cultic activity. That is a international data, widely accepted fact or stat, if you will. 1 out of 8 people will deal with indoctrination. It might even be higher.
I would say it's higher.
In today's climate.
I would say it's higher.
Right?
But
if we're going to lowball it, we'll say 1 in 8. That's almost 1 billion people on the planet.
Yeah.
And couple that with at least 10,000 different types of cults on the planet that can be accounted for, big and small, all flavors. We always say it's the same party of indoctrination. Everyone's just wearing a different costume. Yeah. Right?
Sure.
Different earth suit, different costume. But we've all experienced it at some point.
Yeah. And that one, and I would say if you add in cultic relationships.
Oh, yeah.
You're pretty much covering
everyone,
the majority of the planet. Yeah,
right. It's true.
Yeah, so it's. Yeah, I think without question, this is a universal issue.
Right.
And I think that,
and it's an epidemic, and it's growing.
Well, I don't know if it's it's a great question. Like, is it growing or has it always been here?
Or let me rephrase that.
Are we finally acknowledging it?
Acknowledging it. Yeah. I think we have a more of a bird's eye view of it because of social media and everyone having a phone.
Yeah.
Some sort of smartphone device. So we're aware of it. But social media also propels the problem because then people like ISIS, for example, the main way ISIS has converted people is through social media.
Right. Yeah.
So they're getting Americans. How do you get an American girl to fly over and join ISIS? Social media.
Yeah.
She feels disenfranchised, right? She feels like she doesn't have significance. Come over here. You'll be great. You'll have significance. We're changing the world. She's on a plane.
Yeah.
Read an article about it. That happened.
Yeah.
So social media can propel the problem. Yeah.
No, it's a worldwide universal issue, and shows like ours hopefully just allow that these conversations become more commonplace, and we start using the same nomenclature. I mean, a lot of it is really just recognizing that the things we're describing and the emotional states that people are encountering are actually the same, just maybe we're calling them different things.
Correct.
And so I know one of my big pushes in this area has been just to try to get us all speaking the same language and using the same terms so we can start to identify just how common and universal this issue is. Because I think as long as people don't understand the nomenclature,
I agree with you.
They think, oh, that doesn't apply to me, when actually more than likely it does.
Right. Well, I want to read you something that I think you'll like. I read this in a book. I can't remember the name of the book, so I'll figure it out. Right. But in dealing with the crime scene, I thought this was just an amazing statement to make. An unhealed person can find offense in pretty much anything someone does. A healed person understands that the actions of others have nothing to do with them. Each day, you get to decide which one you will be.
Well, I like it.
Right?
Yeah, I like it because I think ultimately, when I think about the journey I've taken, the biggest step first was forgive myself, right? But ultimately, on some level, I've had to forgive everyone else involved as well.
Yeah.
I mean, even the cult leader, the people that were high up in the organization doing things that I really did not enjoy being on the other side.
That just triggered me. I don't think I've done that. Not triggered me in a bad way. That
but I'm just
did
saying,
a ping.
But it's a hard thing to get to, but to realize that people misbehaving.
Just make a note on that while you're talking. I need to think about that.
They're not born that way. Things happen to them. So, and it's not that I have to know what happened to them, but it's just to have the empathy and understanding of going, I don't believe if they were felt loved and safe, that they would probably behave the way they behave. So
right.
So there's things that happen to that person in such a way. So ultimately, it's not doing me any benefit to continue to demonize them.
Right.
And that's not to say I'm going to forget what happened by any standard.
But there's a difference.
But as far as being able to just not let it tie into my psyche of thinking, oh, I want to see that person get their comeuppance or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not really going to serve.
No.
Ultimately, I mean, so as they say, revenge is like taking poison and expecting someone else to get sick.
Right.
And so I think it's the harder part of it, but it's ultimately what it's about. It's about forgiveness and I actually saw this great film this weekend, which I encourage everyone out there to check out. It's called Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
I saw it.
Isn't that amazing?
Yes, we saw it at the same time, probably.
Amazing.
I mean, my mind was blown. Took me about 45 minutes to leave the theater.
Right. No, it was
like, what just happened?
But yeah, I mean, I can't even imagine how they wrote that script. I mean, it's remarkable.
I'd love to have coffee with that guy.
Yeah, incredible.
Or guys, I think there's two.
It's definitely worth checking out, everybody.
All right. Well, on that note, on our movie recommendation, we will close out.
Let's do it.
The quote of the day.
Sure.
We will bookend this lovely chat. Okay. To live in the body of a survivor is to never be able to leave the scene of the crime. I cannot ignore the fact that I live here. But we can choose to live there as someone who's healed,
right,
or someone who's not healed.
Exactly.
Ah, what a perfect way to end. All right, as usual, please, my friends, guard your hearts and your minds. Nobody else but you should have control of these. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Bye.
No, I won't fall. Just